like if I were to like give a quick tour into this is
Yeah.
your quick tour into backend programming or backend
Yeah.
development. This will be your quick tour. So a lot of it's interestingly I feel like a lot of Firebase people just came from Flutter because apparently they
Yeah.
just go well together. I don't know why, but a lot of Flutter devs just go for Firebase straight away and just see that. I don't know if like that's like I don't know like on like advertisement on Google side or whatever, but they have nothing to do with each other. Right? They
Mm.
like Flutter base has nothing to do with Flutter. Flutter-based is
Interesting.
just a backend solution, um,
Right.
and but Flutter or Firebase happens to have plugins for Flutter, and that's great. Um, but Firebase is actually a really, really, really weird backend solution. It's like rather new. It's actually very, very new.
Okay.
So traditionally, how backend works is that there's a central or many central servers or whatever. Like I'm gonna say the traditional way is that there's one server, one computer sits somewhere,
Yeah.
maybe in your house, maybe in your garage, wherever, like maybe hosted by AWS, and that thing runs a program that you wrote, and that program responds to network requests and send data back, and
Mm.
that's all it does. And
Right.
it could store maybe some data it needs to store somewhere, like it could be in a database, traditionally a relational database, um, maybe sort of like I don't know wherever like whatever database you might think of. Um, can even save that in like its memory, wherever. Just don't turn your computer off. uh, but
Yeah. Right.
but that's the traditional way. And then people thought, oh, that's not really scalable. Like, what if my house burned down, or what if whatever. So people thought, okay, I need to not put my like all my eggs in the same basket. Also, I need like to have like a beefy server, and I can't really have like the beefiness to be scaled infinitely. So I have
Mm.
to sort of like spread the scale, or sorry,
Mm.
spread the load. So
Mm.
people started to have like multiple servers and have a load balancer in front of it,
Mm.
and then sort of like load balance all the servers, and then that was great for a while. And then people weren't really satisfied, so then they thought, okay, essentially what a server is that I just have a bunch of functions, right? Each endpoint has like some sort of purpose. It answers a specific type of call. What if we just isolate that single function and we just make a bunch of functions to be available for our applications, our front ends to call. So that's where the
Mm.
microservices architecture came from, where
Mm.
every single function or a set of functions maybe are just it's just put on a Docker container or put in a Docker container, and that thing can be hosted, by a Docker Swarm, Kubernetes clusters, whatever you can think of. But the idea is that the individual functions could be scaled infinitely, and because the inherent like fact in your app or what usually happens is that some of the functionalities in your backend is used frequently, like maybe like a post view or like maybe like liking a post. That's like functionality that's used often, but like changing your username is not really like used often. So what if we just have like changing our username function to be put on a separate thing, and that thing is maybe like less active, like it's less beefy, it's just a little machine. And what if
Mm.
we have like thousands of like machines ready to handle the liking your post
Mm.
action? So that's the
Yeah.
microservices thing, and that thing kind of depends on the entire Docker containerization technology. But Flutter is a new dude came in town, maybe a new girl, whatever. Very personalized. But Firebase, but like I don't know. I just always imagine Firebase to be a dude. I don't know why.
Yeah. Yeah.
uh, but Firebase challenges the traditional backend way of thinking. Like
Mm.
all the approaches I mentioned, whether load balancer or single server or microservices, they have they all have like accesses to the backend sorry, the backend all have access to to the database, and the
Mm.
users, the end the end clients, do
Mm.
not have any access to the database because that's dangerous, right? The database is where the money is stored. It's where the sensitive
Mm.
information
Yeah.
is where everything is stored. only trusted sources should be able to access the database. Only the trusted sources. Firebase thinks it's differently. Firebase thinks that, okay, what if anybody could access the database, but only parts of the database? Like, what if we have like some rules set in place so that any client, like even though any client can access the database, they can only access the part of the database that was supposed to be granted to them, you know. So that's what Firebase security rules, came in place, and that thing works. I would say, like, I'm not saying that thing doesn't work. I'm saying that thing is new. Like, that's like a completely new way of thinking the backend, and whether that's right or whether that's wrong, it's just pure opinions. But that's why I feel like Firebase is it's a very weird approach, because it's it's definitely different than traditional ways of thinking. But nowadays, a lot of Flutter-based, Flutter-based, a lot of Flutter developers jump in, right? And they see like Firebase, like, oh, yeah, that looks normal. Like they think that as the normal way of doing backend, but that's definitely not the normal way of doing backend, right?
Right.
Okay, so that's like a quick tour of backend technologies. There's definitely more, like there's there's GraphQL. That's like a different world. But I don't think that's really that common to be used among companies. But I would say that Firebase might not always work for your app, because okay, let me be more specific now. So I've been saying Firebase a lot, Firebase, but Firebase isn't really a solution in itself. Firebase is like a suite of tools. What I was more talking is the database section of Firebase. So Firebase Firestore or Firebase real-time database. Those are the two databases Firebase offers. The real-time database thing is like just a huge JSON object. That thing is actually just a huge JSON object. The querying abilities are kind of limited. The advantage is that like it's really real time. It's like really fast. The latency is like below 200 milliseconds. Firebase Firestore, on the other hand, is more like a MongoDB. It's more like collection and documents. There's some limitation on documents, but a collection could be huge, and they have like clever algorithms so that like read times are very optimized. So you would often duplicate your data just to optimize read. And that's where it goes to the differences between SQL databases and NoSQL databases. That's another huge topic. But since this is only about Firebase, I'll just touch on that quickly. Is that in SQL databases, your data is categorized into rows, rows of things, like columns of rows, like a table, like an Excel sheet. But NoSQL databases are not like that. NoSQL databases are object based, so you have like a bunch of things in your database, and the things in your database could come in various forms, and there is no like strict, or there is no limitation on what the forms could be. Really, the forms can be anything. They don't have to look like each other. You obviously kind of want to make them look like each other, so that's easier to write code to deal with that. But if one object is missing like a field, that's totally okay. But yeah, that's the differences between SQL and NoSQL. People have different preferences, but the way of doing things is definitely different. In the SQL land, the rows and column land, what you want to do is that you usually make a query that grabs a lot of data from different tables and then sort of put them together and joins a lot of data together, and you get this big query result back. Your query might have a lot of inner, outer join, whatever. Make your big, like grab whatever things you want, and what you would what people call denormalize your data, so that you spread your data into different roles, or sorry, different tables, and each of them contains like a piece of your data, so that when you're grabbing data, you can grab from those different tables. In this NoSQL land, so like what Firebase Firestore does, is that you might want to just duplicate your data, so that when you want to grab stuff, just grab that one object or grab that one thing, and that thing has all the things you need. Like it's almost like making your database look like what your app UI is, and whether
Mm.
it's good or bad, I don't want to make any judgment calls. uh, but I will say though, what end up happening is that those NoSQL databases, so Firebase, Firestore, get they get more difficult to manage as you go in, because
Okay.
any app, any bigger app has a very, I would say, complex relations between different objects, and usually you want to query, you want to sort of make use of those relations. Just to think about this, I would like I like to make the Twitter example, that imagine you're making Twitter, like a simplified version of Twitter, where there are users, there are tweets, and users could follow each other, right?
Mm.
And now you have a feed, and this is where things get interesting. Like imagine you're making the Twitter app in Flutter, right? And you have a feed. Uh, so obviously, what should be in the feed are tweets that are posted by the people who you followed, right? That's a relation, right? What I just said is a relation. You want to grab all the tweet objects that are linked to the user objects that are that happen to be linked to you in a directional way. So how you're supposed to do that in Firebase, right? It
Mm.
gets really complicated, because now you have to think of, oh, okay, I want to optimize my read, so I want to just do one call, like maybe it could be just in my object. I could just grab this one object, or maybe one collection of objects that happen to have all the posts that I'm looking for. So
Mm.
you think about it. Yeah, like you have to think about how you engineer your data. Compared to SQL databases, it's kind of dumb, stupidly simple. Super simple in the way that you just have a table of users, a table of posts, and a table of relations. And you just
Mm.
run a super simple query, you get all of them. It might not be as
Mm.
fast, but it is definitely simple. Like
Mm.
it's no brain. This is probably the easiest SQL query you can do. Um, but yeah. So going back to
That was good.
Firebase,
Yeah, yeah.
I think I hope I am not going everywhere.
No,
But
this is really useful. Keep going.
think I really appreciate that. But going back to the Firebase scalability problem, like
Yeah.
how scalable is Firebase? I would say though that do not really worry about scalability, because premature optimization is the root to all evil. Like I'm pretty sure like
Mm.
you might have like heard of that quote.
Good point.
In a way that like scalability, like if you actually have to face that problem, if like a lot of users are using your app, like all of a sudden that's a good problem to have, for you to have to worry, right? That's a good problem. Um, and what you want to
Yeah.
do, what you end up wanting to do is that you want to have that problem, and you're gonna
Yeah.
face that problem either way. Um,
Mm.
so I feel like what Flutter really stands for is how quickly you can get things off the ground, like how quickly you can make MVPs, and that's kind of
Mm.
what Firebase is also standing for. Like
Mm.
it's just very fast for you to prototype.
Mm. That's a good point.
But
That's
yeah,
that's that's I'm so happy the way you like summarized it as well at the end. Like just giving the pros of cons of different approaches. You know what I mean?
mhm.
Um, but yeah,
um,
I especially like what you said at the end as well. Like to not worry too much about like premature optimization. You know?
mm, yeah. That being said, though, I do want to like warn people of like pros and
Yeah.
cons. So let
Yeah.
me just
Yeah.
give you like my experience. So
Mm.
I initially started with started my app with SQL, and so that was the first app. So give you a little bit more context. Uh, the app I'm currently working on has a predecessor, um, like that was like before the app. So those two apps are kind of similar. Um,
Mm.
so but in the previous app, I used SQL first, and then
Yeah.
that's when I like first started using Fire, or that's when I first started looking at Firebase. I was like, whoa, this thing is really cool, because the reason for that is I use Firebase authentication. That worked really well, right? And
Mm.
then I thought, okay, like I want to tie my authentication, data to my database. I want to like tie that. Like, oh, Firebase, Cloud Firestore is a really cool integration. They have happen to be a good database. I'm like, okay, cool. So I transitioned using um, Firestore. The person I'm working with also, thought that was cool. So we used Firestore and we were happy with it, until probably like I would say like a year in, like 1 year into using Firestore, and that's when we have huge diagrams of how our Firestore database is. And
Mm.
what Firestore doesn't tell you is what data is really supposed to look like. Like that's being described in your code, not in Firestore itself. Whereas
Mm.
in the SQL side, your SQL database, your SQL databases tells you exactly where a database looks like, because you like give it, the shapes and forms of what your data is supposed to look like. So things start to get kind of messy, and what really like kind of stopped us from, like kind of hindered us in production was that like we started kind of like, we started pivot our app. Like we have some like things that we want to pivot. Like there's some functionalities that changed in the way that we have to reformat the data, and that's such a pain
Mm.
in the ass. Like in Firebase, I remember like we used to make like whatever like there's a business logic that grabs all the users posts in a specific way, and that's defined in your app. That happens all the time. Like with any app, your app would pivot. um, you might have new functionalities, and Firebase is extraordinarily bad at dealing with that, because
Mm.
you would have to like you will have to engineer your data structure to work with your application, and when your application changes,
Mm.
it like sometimes the changes will be really small, like on screen, but your data might have to change dramatically.
Mm.
That doesn't happen too much with SQL databases, but it happens a lot with those NoSQL databases like Firebase or
Mm.
Firestore or MongoDB. So
Yeah.
that is dangerous. I definitely want to warn you against that. So now we
Right.
migrated off of that. Um, we're kind of running short on time, but I also just want to post a huge con in Firebase land is that Firebase also provides you a way of like having your own backend code. So there's this thing called Firebase Cloud Functions. It
Mm.
is kind of similar to what I mentioned for the microservice architecture. So
Yeah.
it's sort of like Firebase allows you to write some JavaScript functions that could be run uh, either triggered by a document change, or a user could be calling that function. So it's sort of like a backend. Because sometimes you don't really totally 100% trust your clients to change your database, right?
Mm.
So it does have that, but that has a like tremendously bad code code start time. So what code start is that when your endpoint doesn't get called for too long, it will be resources will be
Mm.
deallocated, and when you wanna like when the user wants to call that function takes a long time to run, and that's also kind of like not acceptable. So we
Right.
eventually migrated off from Firebase, and we used our own backend. By our own backend, right now we're on AWS Elastic Beanstalk. It's pretty much like traditional load balanced backend architecture. But yeah, that's my sort of journey of using backend stuff.
That was
I hope
amazing.
that's helpful.
No, that was for me. It was so helpful, and I'm sure anyone listening that's interested in this stuff, I'm sure what you just said, and you gave a really nice summary of the whole situation as well, and for your own personal solutions, like the journey that you went through. Like I think that was very very useful. So
Thank
what
you.
would you say?
Appreciate
Like,
it.
I think I don't know. Just going back to what you were saying about why people use Firebase, and maybe I don't know if
Mm-hmm.
it's because just Google made it and they're just marketing it kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, when I was first getting into Flutter, it just seemed like that just kept popping up Firebase, and then maybe because there's
Yeah.
so many tutorials on there, and then it's like a network effect kind of thing. People just start gravitating towards that. But like, yeah, you answered a lot of questions that I had in my mind about it, like a lot of doubts and is this really the right way to go sort of question. And so
Mm.
that's good. What if someone asks you like me, if I'm trying to make an app that is kind of uh not to the extent of complexity as Twitter, but similar vein where you've got users and people liking each other's tweets or whatever. Like what would you recommend for someone? Does it really depend on just your expertise level? Because you're very experienced, and like what would you say to someone who's just learning Flutter? Like I guess there's no real correct solution. Like how would you
Uh,
guide me
I
off
would
off
recommend.
Firebase? Yeah.
Yeah, I would recommend that if you want to make an app, your purpose is not learning. Go with the technology you're familiar with, and that's good. If you want to learn, that's cool. You can learn. But let's say you are not familiar with either. You're not familiar with like neither of the technologies. You're not
Mm.
familiar with you've never used SQL, nor have you ever used NoSQL. In this
Mm.
case, I recommend Firebase. But in the
Mm.
case that you have experience in both, I think you would probably have the same opinion as I would probably have. Is that just go SQL
Okay.
all the way. Um,
Okay.
but yeah, if you don't have any experience and you want to learn either, you want to start from either one. I would say actually like Firebase is a good place to start because
Right.
because how easy it is. You don't
Mm.
have to write backend code, and that kind of removes a
Yeah.
lot of you know effort you probably need to learn.
Yeah. No, that's a good answer. And but you're saying like in terms of like long term though,
Yeah, long
you
term,
know, yeah.
yeah, companies use SQL for a reason. Uh,
Right.
but yeah.
Yeah. No, that makes total sense. Like when I was making the games like Snake, and my game was
Hmm.
an offline game, right? And I want to just make it online, and I wanted people to like put their high scores in, so like we can see like a leaderboard. And so
Hmm.
just to do that, yeah, I don't know how to write any backend code. So I used like the Firebase hosting and like those things, and it was just very easy to set up very quickly. But like again, I feel like I'm at the point where I need to go beyond that. Like I need to listen to what you're
Hmm.
saying. You know what I mean? Like to make an actual legit app, I need to learn this stuff. But yeah, you're a genius. You're a little
No.
genius. Like actually, like did you learn this from just your own experience, or did you learn it from like a class you took? Like where did all this come from? Like all that knowledge.
Yeah, man, Stack Overflow.
Yeah.
But
Well, so
no,
you
like
are a
more like more
genius.
like
Like
more like YouTube videos and stuff. Like we all have like this experience of like we just want to make something. We don't like know what to do, and then we end up going through like all the rabbit holes, and then just end up, oh, okay, now I know. But wow, that was a lot
right.
to go through.